I'm very pleased tonight to introduce my good friend Timothy Jackson, who has been here this term at Harvard teaching ethics, but also helping us build these new conversations. He is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory there, and has held previous teaching posts at Rhodes College, Yale University, Stanford University, and the University of Notre Dame. As well as having been a fellow here this term, he's been a visiting fellow in the past at the Center of Theological Inquiry in Princeton, the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale, and the Center for the Study of Religion at Princeton University. Professor Jackson received his BA in philosophy from Princeton and his PhD in philosophy and religious studies from Yale. He's the author of a number of distinguished books on Agape ethics, the first being Love Disconsoled, 1999, the next, The Priority of Love, Christian Charity and Social Justice, that came out in 2003, and though he has recently edited a volume on the morality of adoption, his new book, which is nearly finished, I believe, is called Political Agape, A Defense of Prophetic Liberalism, and that is reasonably shortly forthcoming, I think.
Yes.
I would like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Jackson for his presence here this term, which has had an enormously significant effect on our conversations as we try to build these new links between evolutionary biology, primatology, ethics, theology, and psychological biology. Professor Jackson, as you'll see today, has a quite punchy and critical view about the discourses of evolutionary biology as they relate to the phenomenon of cooperation and of the emergence of altruism. But his critical but sympathetic presence here has made an enormous difference in these interactions that we are building up. I thank you, Professor Jackson. And we look forward today now to hearing his thoughts on the topic of God, evolution, and agape. He tells me this is the first time he's ever used PowerPoint, so I think we can expect some demonic hijinks, but we hope not. Professor Jackson.
Demonic hijinks from the machine, not from me, I hope. But thank you, Sarah, so much. And I did want to take the occasion to say thank you to the Harvard community. I've really enjoyed this semester here, both the teaching and the work with Martin and Sarah in the PED, the Program for Evolutionary Dynamics. It'll be sad to leave, indeed. But I'd like to talk today about God, evolution, and agape. The subtitles, as you see, are Ethics and the Limits of Naturalistic Explanation, or somewhat playfully, Recovering a Venerable Harvard Tradition of Anti-Naturalism. I'd like to start, indeed, with a quote from Harvard's own William James. This is from Is Life Worth Living? If this life be not a real fight, in which something is eternally gained for the universe by success, it's no better than a game of private theatricals from which one may withdraw at will. But it feels like a real fight, as if there were something really wild in the universe, which we, with all our idealities and faithfulness, are needed to redeem. And first of all, to redeem our own hearts from atheisms and fears. For such a half-wild, half-saved universe, our nature is adapted. Unquote. I'll come back to that later. But as Sarah suggests, it feels like a fight to me, and I'll say more about that in a minute. In Chapter 4 of On the Origin of Species, Darwin briefly discusses why birds sing. It's often, he notes, a function of, quote, the severest rivalry between the males of many species to attract by singing the females, unquote. A particularly strong or melodious song will contribute to reproductive success, both by inducing females to mate, and one might add, by announcing territoriality to other males. Now, Darwin, of course, was unaware of modern genetics, but neo-Darwinians would say that a strikingly robust or appealing song makes it more likely that the male will be able to get his genes into the next generation, and over time, natural selection will reinforce or palpably augment that fitness. Call that the naturalistic explanation of why birds sing. Now, in chapter 10 of To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch says to his son Jim, as you may well know, Jim, whom he's given an air rifle for Christmas, quote, "I'd rather you shoot at tin cans in the backyard, but I know you'll go after birds. Shoot all the blue jays you want if you can hit them, but remember it's a sin to kill a mockingbird," unquote. Miss Maudie then explains to Scout, who's also received an air rifle, quote, "Your father's right. Mockingbirds don't do one thing but make music for us to enjoy. They don't eat up people's gardens. They don't nest in corn cribs. They don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird," unquote. Now, is the singing of birds any less beautiful, any less the cause of Jim's and Scout's appreciation and respect when we know the naturalistic explanation? In the novel, the mockingbird is a metaphor for innocence, but scientifically, of course, it's no more altruistic than the blue jay, no more singing for our enjoyment. Presumably, the mockingbird's song is sparked by exactly the same evolutionary forces as that of any other bird. Is there an either-or, then, between Darwin's finches and Harper Lee's finch? I'm borrowing Gregory Peck there. It looks like he's actually going hunting for finches. But now, I suspect that many of us here today would say not at all. There is no conflict. That is, you might actually enjoy bird songs all the more when you know the complex evolutionary dynamic behind them. Who cares why birds sing, biologically speaking? It's the aesthetic result that matters. It's the melody that moves us. We should want to conserve wildlife, moreover, for the sake of its intrinsic delicacy and loveliness, independent of any anthropocentric, much less theocentric reasoning. Fine, I would agree for purposes of argument. But here's the question. Is the tale the same in ethics? That is it only consequences that count, as arguably in aesthetics, at least regarding the productions of nature? Or are results only part of the ethical story? What about the motive of the agent and the form of his or her action? What moral philosophers call eritology and deontology. Can altruism, for instance, be accounted for purely in evolutionary terms, in terms of utility, in terms of consequences? Can altruism be accounted for in that way and still be itself? Now, in The Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin himself wondered about moral motive. That is, he asked whether the self-immolation of a slave that he had witnessed were, quote, "the noble love of freedom," unquote, or mere brutal obstinacy, unquote. In On the Origin of Species, moreover, he recognized quite explicitly that the reality of self-sacrifice was a major challenge to his theory of, quote, "success in the battle for life," unquote. Now, have we made real advances on these matters since Darwin's time? I'd like today to examine the ways in which naturalistic explanations of human behavior, including some versions of evolutionary game theory, tend to erode the very idea of virtue, especially theological virtue. The erosion, I hasten to add, may be intentional or unintentional, but I think it's nonetheless real. In the process, I'll wrestle with some familiar puzzles pretty familiar to us all. If the summum bonum of Darwinian evolution is getting one's own or closely related genes into the next generation, then how can we account for the prestige and durability of a character trait like agapic love, especially if agapic love involves self-sacrifice? If more expansively, neo-Darwinism admits of cultural evolution, wherein the highest good is replicating one's ideas, one's means, not just one's genes, then the challenge, it seems to me, is to relate the genetic process to the ideational one. Familiar question. How do you relate biological evolution to cultural evolution? How do they bear on each other normatively? Now, drawing on the Judeo-Christian tradition, I'll identify agape, and I use the term agape for this purpose more or less interchangeably with altruism. Altruism was coined the term by Comte with reference to the Latin root alter, meaning the other, his emphasis on concern for the other. But I think it's fair to say within the Christian tradition, agape/altruism involves three interpersonal features. At least this is how I'll interpret it. The first, unconditional willing of the good for the other. The second, equal regard for the well-being of the other. And the third, passionate service open to self-sacrifice for the sake of the other. And I apologize to my students. They've heard this all ad infinitum, ad nauseum. Here's the point. To the extent that agape involves disinterestedness, disinterested concern for others, including openness to self-sacrifice, even for a stranger or enemy, it would seem inevitably to be weeded out by natural selection, understood genetically. Agapists willingly reduce, or at least risk reducing, their reproductive success for the sake of others. Prudence, perhaps even justice as reciprocity, might be sustained as a survival value within a Darwinian universe. But a number of human actions, from extrafamilial and transracial adoption to building handicapped access ramps to heroic suffering and death, at least on the face of it, must seem somewhat contradictory to most naturalists. And tell me, of course, if you think I'm wrong, but this is particularly true, I think, if naturalism implies physical determinism, a debatable point. Now let me sin boldly and try to articulate a little bit some of these three features, noting what they're not. And I say sin boldly because I'm showing this picture from Guido Reni, his Charity. I think it's a study in the changing iconography of virtue. Let me ask, is this a defensive picture? I think, for what it's worth, that it's, if you will, fully illustrative of the pros and cons of agape. What do I have in mind? Seeing it's in the Metropolitan Museum, but it strikes me that one can read off of this painting the three features I just articulated. That is, here's the Madonna holding a child asleep, supporting it unconditionally, if you will, without reciprocity, unconditional commitment to the good. I note that on traditional readings, this doesn't mean unconditional obedience. Right? Unconditional willing the good for another doesn't mean simply acquiescing in whatever they may ask. But it does mean affirming their good without attention to merit or demerit. Equal regard for the well-being of the other. Here, the Madonna is literally regarding this child. Interestingly, she seems to be looking slightly over the child's head, as though looking to where the child will be when it grows. But there's a kind of regard on both sides there. But equal regard, the second feature of agape, is not to be equated with identical treatment. Meaning you meet people where they are. To attend to their individual worth will take different shapes according to different contexts. And then lastly, passionate service open to self-sacrifice for the sake of the other. Now here I would hasten to add that it's not masochism or profligacy. That is, it's openness to self-sacrifice, not simply running headlong to sacrifice whenever it beckons. What I have in mind here, in particular, is the feminist critique of agape. Right? Look at this picture. On the one hand, you may say there's a certain beauty to it, but the three receivers of care are all male. At least the two here are palpably male. This one's usually construed to be male. Right? Moreover, the Madonna seems literally drained dry. Right? So in a way, it's sort of the feminist's worst nightmare. The woman's doing all the giving, the males are doing all the receiving. And I think that's a palpable critique of this sort of icon of virtue. Hence the feminist critique. There are dangers to appeals to self-sacrifice. There are dangers to appeals to agape. And I'm sort of trying to get this out because I think you have to before you move on to talk more specifically about agape and evolution. The dangers of appeal to agape in general, especially self-sacrifice. Here I think of Susan Wolf, professor of philosophy at UNC. Wolf argues in an essay entitled Moral Saints that altruism, charity, really isn't a virtue at all. That is, it's so humanly impoverishing to constantly be thinking of the good of other people, to be constantly putting those concerns over your own legitimate self-interest, that Wolf really suggests that she wouldn't want her friends or family to be saints, and she even, again, thinks it finally not an ideal at all. Not just it's difficult, but it ought not to be aspired to. Why? Again, because in her view, it's sort of humanly impoverishing. A famous example, what do you do if you've promised to meet a student at 5:30 in the afternoon to talk about their paper, when at 4:30 you're told that you can get 2 tickets to Pavarotti? What trumps? And I think for Wolf, you do what would be aesthetically cultivating. In this rare instance, you go hear Pavarotti, right? This sort of moral obligation that one would associate with promise keeping, much less charity. Just doesn't necessarily override. Sometimes it may, sometimes it may not. That said, you might well say, well, even if agape is a virtue, even if altruism with these features is an ideal, it's especially dangerous to appeal to it if we live, as we still do, in a gendered society with a division of labor where still women are expected to be primary caregivers, men often the beneficiaries. All this going to say, I talk about equal opportunity. Agape altruism is an equal opportunity employer. It's not simply a gendered virtue. More than that, I think informed consent is important, as well as constructiveness. That is, it matters what motive you're employing. Again, the question of motive. If you're giving to others, if you're willing others good because you think you're garbage, right, if it's masochistically inspired, that's a kind of internal coercion psychologically that's not appropriate. Moreover, if it's merely profligate, if loving others is utterly inattentive to consequences, that's also problematic. Two caveats then needed. Open to self-sacrifice if consensual and constructive, but indeed open to self-sacrifice. Like Christ himself, several times in Scripture, will display a prudence where he avoids self-sacrifice because his time has not yet come, avoids letting an angry or violent crowd lay hands on him. Clear enough? For what it's worth, this is an old teacher of mine, Margaret Farley at Yale, Letty Russell, who'll be here next week, a colleague at Yale, and then Ann Nesamiyu, who's a professor at Kenyatta University, works on AIDS and women's health. But the feminist critique, in short, has to be attended to. That said, let me move back a bit then more to my text. Benevolence, altruism, agape, including openness to self-sacrifice, is culturally powerful, it will be claimed. We needn't look only at genetics. Since the emergence of language and intentionality, human beings are free to pursue ends that are not dictated by their biology. Martin helps me see this. Again, however, the issue I want to wrestle with is how do the two types of evolution interact, biological and cultural? And can they be in conflict? Two related questions here. First, how could natural selection have first generated an altruistic impulse, given its seeming reproductive disadvantage? And secondly, if natural selection is behind altruism after all, can or should we continue to practice or applaud it once we know its evolutionary explanation? Well, we may not be that troubled by the naturalistic explanation of why birds sing, but can we know and believe the naturalistic explanation as to why we are charitable and still be charitable? These two questions, in turn, can only be answered when we understand the relation between genetic and cultural evolution. Take the example of Christianity's founder. Jesus is willing and loved to go to the cross childless and thus must seem in purely genetic terms a paradigmatic loser who foolishly surrenders the greatest human good. In cultural terms, in contrast, he's one of the most prolific breeders in history. Again, as Martin has helped me see, his teachings have spread around the world, influencing countless persons and institutions. Does the Messiah's historic impact represent what might be called a teleological suspension of the genetic, that is, revealing a higher value than physical progeny? If so, critics will ask, how can blind chance have cast up such a purposeful, dignified being who could prefer death before dishonor, cultural redemption to biological reproduction? And of course, the questions become perennial. Evolutionary biologists and game theorists, of course, have recently claimed to make important strides in solving that long-standing puzzle. Indeed, several very notable ones are in this room. Sophisticated versions of the ultimatum game, the prisoner's dilemma, titles like Chaos and the Evolution of Cooperation, the Arithmetics of Mutual Help, the Economics of Fair Play, Empathy Leads to Fairness, and so on. These sorts of evolutionary biological or psychological accounts often indeed do claim to explain how naturalistic evolution and traditional virtue are compatible, even mutually implying. The common refrain, however, as far as I can understand it, is that what looks like selfishness actually pays dividends, if only indirectly, either to oneself or to one's close biological relatives, so-called kin altruism. In effect, the biologists and game theorists often, at least, tend to use the assumed reality of Darwinian evolution to explain away agape, I fear, even as pious believers often use the assumed reality of biblical agape to explain away evolution, both sometimes using terms imprecisely. Now, what is someone like myself to do? That is, someone inclined to affirm both the reality of robust altruism and the fact of biological evolution. It does seem to me there's undeniable evidence of speciation across time and so on. So again, how can we reconcile cultural and genetic imperatives? If ideas are analogous to genes, with survival of the fittest being applicable to moral traditions as well as physical bodies, what are the mechanisms of and standards of such fitness? Now, the brilliance of many game theoretic models is beyond question, but here's the problem. It seems to me that there's often a creeping conflation of mutual advantage or prudence with agapic love or compassion. In addition, causal explanations of impersonal processes, what philosophers would call efficient causes, are at times confused with or insufficiently related to moral motivations of personal agents, final causes. On the first score, it doesn't matter that much whether we talk about genuine utility or rational cooperation or indirect reciprocity, for it's one thing to endorse fairness because it pays or because you fear that your relatives will otherwise get the short end of the evolutionary stick. It's something else to affirm another's well-being, even though you and yours need never fear injustice or barrenness yourselves. Indeed, even though it involves your voluntarily surrendering properly accessible values, like progeny or good reputation. We're back with Gyges' ring and Socrates' question about the motive for doing good. Have we gotten beyond Socrates, much less beyond Darwin, on these questions? So let me summarize a bit. Let me state again my main problem with game theoretic and other naturalistic accounts of altruism. Again, I'm treating it for present purposes as synonymous with agape or neighbor love. I'm not alone in this misgiving, of course. If agape unconditionally wills the good of the other, for the other's and or God's sake, and if agape is open to self-sacrifice, however qualified, but a self-sacrifice that outstrips reciprocity, much less personal advantage, then talk of tit for tat or win, stay, lose, shift, kin altruism, indirect reciprocity, and the like, is largely beside the point, it seems to me. That is, such phrases may capture aspects of social cooperation, understood as action coordinated for mutual benefit, but they may even expand the normal bounds of our concern in some respects. But they still basically reduce love of neighbor to a form of personal prudence. It may be that apparently or reputedly altruistic behavior is in reality motivated by fundamentally self-regarding agendas, but then it's simply better to concede, it seems to me, that Nietzsche and Freud were right. I mean, if you're with me, I'm not saying that necessarily agape is real, and this is how people actually behave. I'm saying it feels like a fight, meaning it may be that we ought to conclude in light of evolutionary biology and naturalism that, again, Nietzsche and Freud were right. That is, love of neighbor is unnatural and self-deceived. Right? Freud thought agape was unjust. You shouldn't love everybody unconditionally. It's unjust to your friends who actually do have a more profound claim on you. And it will make you petulant and unhappy in the end to try. Right? So again, why not say, in effect, evolutionary psychology shows that Nietzsche and Freud were right. It can't really be done, at least by the vast majority of individuals. I know Martin has said he's more concerned with the average person than the saint. But again, Nietzsche and Freud would say, even for the saint to try to do it, we'll end up being petulant and unhappy. Susan Wolf would say, again, humanly impoverished. Finally, to embrace what I've called the agapic ideal would be simply to fail to understand your own mind as inherited from the Paleolithic past. Now, importantly, the judgment that evolutionary theorists often reduce altruism to rational self-interest holds for both biological and cultural evolution, as far as I can see. Both genes and memes are selfish, it seems, with the universal love being an ideal cultural construct that makes up for genetic reproductive failure. And the really interesting wrinkle, of course, is where to really be good at indirect reciprocity, you cultivate a reputation for being giving, for being cooperative, even for being self-sacrificial. But you cultivate the reputation simply so that you will believe it and therefore not be found out to indeed be acting out of self-interest. Right? The really effective sort of competitor is one who is understood to be self-sacrificial when in fact they're simply deluded. Okay, let me turn now to talk further about consequences, motives, and means. Martin Novak and Carl Sigman have observed, quote, in the terminology based on Hamilton, Trivers, and Wilson, an act is said to be altruistic if it's costly to perform but confers a benefit on another individual. In evolutionary biology, costs and benefits are measured in Darwinian fitness, which means reproductive success, unquote. Now, that does seem to me to be a very apt summary of the relevant literature. And again, I'm not faulting that definition as such, but notice two things about it. One, an altruistic act is defined entirely in terms of consequences. Secondly, good and bad consequences are identified exclusively with succeeding in or failing at reproduction. Such reproductive utilitarianism, it seems to me, is indeed characteristic of evolutionary psychology in general and much game theory in particular. And again, the consequentialism at work seems unaffected by whether the reproductive success is measured in genetic or cultural terms. To focus on replicating genes or proliferating means is not to ask about the motives of agents or the forms of their actions. I don't think, moreover, that misgivings about the terminology can be glossed over as mere semantics. That is, reproductive utilitarianism is morally minimalist, to say the least, and it often assumes what is quite debatable. That is, that competition for advantage is the only game in town. In-group affinity is what much of morality seeks to limit. That is, tribalism and nepotism are almost universally frowned upon morally, though they're very common empirically. Now, again, one might say that an author is at liberty to define terms as he or she sees fit, but I'll simply ask again, is it edifying to omit motive as well as form of action? Is an act really altruistic if it's done expecting or even demanding a return? And what if the act is coerced rather than voluntary? Does it still count? Wouldn't we say that someone who helped another only because he anticipated a reward or were merely looking for further reputation, wouldn't we consider such a person to be merely shamming? We might not fault him or her. We might concede that few human motivations are completely without self-seeking. I'm fond of Kierkegaard's quote that you can no more separate hypocrisy from being human than you can separate sliminess from being a fish. So you can grant a good deal of deep sort of ambivalence here. But again, we're even in noting that attending to motives. Now, the song of a road-breasted grosbeak or a yellow warbler may be beautiful to us, in spite of the lack of any avian intention to create that beauty, even as the Grand Canyon is awe-inspiring without its being self-aware. Unlike with aesthetic effects or natural states, however, motives and means do matter in ethics. That's because human beings have inwardness. That is, inwardness is partly constitutive of who we are and what we experience. I won't go on to elaborate that in any further detail, but it does seem to me, for example, that if I say sincerely, I'm in pain, I am in fact in pain, and that's a subjectively relevant fact about me. It matters how I perceive myself, in other words. That's partly constitutive of my identity, unlike with rocks, say. So here's the payoff. A certain motivational structure is necessary for real altruism. It's not a sufficient one, perhaps. Again, actions and effects matter too. More importantly, these are arguably the three dimensions of the moral life. I won't go into this since time's fleeting, but I think the moral life can and should be thought of as having at least three dimensions: the character of the agent, the form of action, the consequences of action. For Christians and other theists, the will of God is, if you will, a fourth overarching undergirding dimension that, in fact, sustains the other three. But here's the point. No end of mischief is caused in ethics, it seems to me, if you try to reduce the moral life to just one dimension alone. Right? To look only at character is not sufficient. The road to hell is paved with good intention. To look only at consequences, however, is also problematic. If we maximize only utility, especially reproductive advantage, then there's no way to avoid an unjust sacrifice of the individual for that corporate end. Forms of action matter as well, voluntary versus coerced and the like. Clear enough? Let me just pause. Is this tolerably clear? Maybe transparently clear. Now, let me talk now a little bit more about the relation between doing good and doing well. There's certainly a burgeoning literature seeking to document the myriad ways in which altruistic behavior redounds to an agent's benefit. The frequent thesis is that behaving benevolently makes one happier and healthier or secures a public reputation. Again, I take this to be the prime point of indirect reciprocity. A reputation that makes one better off, or at least one's loved ones better off in the long run. Endorphins, if not Eden, are the payoff for other regarding ethics. But I remain myself a bit skeptical of such medical and sociological optimism. Jesus went to the cross a despised and physically broken man. After all, Gandhi and King were assassinated. But you have to distinguish, I think, in any event, between the beneficial consequences of altruism and its primary moral motivation. Again, inevitably, otherwise, you'll end up focusing on self. Self-interested flourishing has its place, to be sure, but at least in the Christian tradition, I would argue it's the flower rather than the root of virtue. Jesus, anyway, was neither eudaemonist, focusing on personal benefit, nor nepotist, focusing either on direct or inclusive fitness. The notorious passage, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I've come not to bring peace, but a sword." One's foes will be members of one's own household. "Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." Again, you may think that pure folly, but I take it it's certainly an indictment of something like family-oriented nepotism. Jesus sets family members against each other precisely to the extent that he commands them to love all neighbors regardless of biological, that is genetic, or ethnic, cultural relatedness. He commands his followers, in effect, to overcome both the selfish gene and the selfish meme. Now, undoubtedly, practicing charity can awaken you to a higher sense of what makes for genuine happiness or human flourishing. But in ordinary temporal terms, altruism open to self-sacrifice doesn't necessarily redound to the benefit of the lover and his or her family. You do indeed sometimes suffer genuine loss. Again, perhaps so much the worse for agape, but any account that reduces it to something like enlightened self-interest does seem to be talking about something other than the virtue. I would say perhaps the most troubling implication of most evolutionary biology is that the human person herself becomes seemingly epiphenomenal. The human person, him or herself, becomes seemingly epiphenomenal to the genes and their replication strategies. It's hard to understand, again, how a genuine self-sacrificial attitude towards another might emerge. I don't mean to set nature against grace here, but I do mean to resist the temptation to identify nature with competition and in turn have that understanding ground in an account of agape. Okay, let me turn now to what I'll call the question of teleology. Neo-Darwinism understands biological evolution as descent with variation, which in turn is explained in terms of random mutation and natural selection. A crucial question, I think, is this an ateleological or an anti-teleological view? What's that mean? Is it a view that simply prescinds from talk of design or purposefulness, or is it one that in fact rules it out? Anti-teleological in the sense of judging somehow appeals to design or purpose as illegitimate. Now, if it's anti-teleological, an obvious question is, what justifies seeing biological evolution as this sort of self-sufficient or closed material system without a first cause or final end? What justifies the dismissal of teleology, moreover, from accounts of human life quite generally? Interestingly, Darwin himself remained ambivalently agnostic about the deep questions of life's genesis and eschaton. More on this in a minute. But as I understand it, most neo-Darwinian theory denies two teleological moments, if you will, two senses of teleology at work in evolution. First, it's not the case that God intentionally designed each species as such or from scratch. Rather, descent with variation, roughly random mutation coupled with natural selection, fully explains speciation across time without reference to divine intention or intervention. The complexity and beauty of the forms of life may seem to be designed, but that's really a misleading appraisal. There is no purposefulness in physical nature. The dynamic patterns of nature are material and contingent, that is non-teleological all the way down. The second sense of the denial of teleology is that it's not the case that God intentionally established even the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, and then set the cosmic ecosystem loose to generate results on its own. That denial is different from the first, in that the second case even rules out a kind of deistic or meta-operative God. Now, several of Darwin's contemporaries, Harvard botanist Asa Gray, for example, readily accepted evolution as the mechanism for the production of species, but continued to see God as the intelligent designer of the laws of evolution itself. Interestingly, even Darwin himself conceded at times that nature and its laws were designed. Sort of interesting ambivalence there on Darwin's part, it seems to me. But what you get as a fundamental disagreement nonetheless between Gray and Darwin was on specific creation. What's that mean? What divided Gray and Darwin was the question of whether any specific result of evolution is planned. Right? I'm noting that Darwin, at least at times, will say the laws of nature and nature itself is designed, but it's still a largely random system. Darwin held that specific results of evolution were unplanned, undesigned, while Gray argued that evolution was guided in channels preordained by God. As Paul Davies has recently put it, it's as though we were expected. Davies, the physicist, suggests that there are so many constants about physical laws that if they were even slightly different, all life would be impossible. Davies puts it in terms of it's as though we were expected. Now, I think this dispute is crucial. This dispute between Gray and Darwin is crucial because it does highlight the conflict between Darwin and Christianity. Based on Genesis and the centrality of the incarnation, Christianity teaches that human beings were made in the image of God, that is, designed. This Darwin denies. Again, don't get me wrong, this may well be so much the worse for Christianity. It may be so much the worse for Asa Gray and a kind of archaic effort still to talk about specific results. But that said, I don't think we can dodge the fact that there really is a fight here. There really is a difference. Contra Darwin, one might hold that the concrete results of the evolutionary process involve an element of chance, but that the process was antecedently structured and coherent and even pointing towards a particular end. Rather like Abner Doubleday inventing the rules of baseball and defining victory, but leaving the outcomes of actual games open-ended. Some Victorian Christians even found it more majestic, more suggestive of omnipotence, that God should, quote, make creatures make themselves, as John Hedley Brooke points out. That is, more majestic that God should make creatures make themselves than constantly having to be tinkering ad hoc. Again, even this sort of teleology at one remove is usually rejected by contemporary neo-Darwinians. Of course, again, I've said nothing against the neo-Darwinian account. I'm trying to put it in logical space, right? Trying to show a real fight brewing. Now, slightly elaborating the second point I just made, most neo-Darwinian theory treats genetic evolution as self-sufficient and a closed material system. That is, it neither makes nor tolerates reference to first cause or final end of biological processes. Descent with variation proceeds according to certain causal physical laws, with reproductive fitness being the only or at least the dominant good. Natural selection as such need not be fully deterministic. That is, need not be governed by hard necessity. There may be a measure of contingency again, even a measure of human free choice at a certain evolutionary point. But even if natural selection does not strictly entail or presume a naturalism that rules out human freedom, there's still a kind of irreducible arbitrariness or randomness here, wherein human life, again, is simply unplanned. Individuals who succeed in producing offspring, moreover, will get their genes into the next generation. Those who do not will suffer genetic oblivion, as Robert Wright puts it. And that's the end of the scientific story. Life may seem designed to repeat, but just as there's no teleology in nature, so there's no teleology behind or beyond nature. We need not, indeed may not, appeal to God as the first cause of physics, chemistry, and biology, any more than we can appeal to the final end of redemption or beatitude as the point of it all. There's only what Darwin called the struggle for life without meaningful first cause or final end again. So as George Gaylord Simpson has put it, man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. Say one more time, that's a perfectly intelligible, if poignant, position. But I think you can legitimately ask, is it dictated either by empirical evidence, molecular biology, the taxonomy of species, the fossil record, or by the scientific method as such? Is it unscientific to ask if evolution itself might be created and evolving, even if we can give no definitive answer? Must scientific naturalism explain everything about human life, including morality and religion? Again, Asa Gray didn't think so. Whatever one's answer here, it does seem to me fundamentally an article of faith that's not scientifically demonstrable. We can debate that too. The great number of extinctions, the apparently chaotic twists and turns of evolution, the sheer mass of pain and death in the world, I think might well indeed move you to reject any sort of purposefulness in the natural order. Now again, John Hedley Brooke points out that Darwin's loss of his beloved daughter Annie moved him to reject biblical Christianity. And again, that's a perfectly intelligible attitude. Having said that, again, I would argue that Darwin in some respects remained kind of ambivalently agnostic about the deep questions of life's genesis and end. But again, is it unscientific to think of evolution itself as a creature, as a created reality with first cause and final end? Now, in addition to Asa Gray, a major and underappreciated peer of Darwin who takes an alternate tack is Charles Sanders Peirce, another Harvard-associated figure. Peirce is an interesting and still to a degree, I think, underappreciated individual. In some unpublished notes now housed in Houghton Library here at Harvard, Peirce writes, quote, "I've always suspected that Darwin must have been influenced by Malthus and the political economists. The study of political economy is apt to betray men into a generalization which is extremely doubtful and certainly most repugnant to our higher instincts, namely that the greatest agency of civilization is greed and all that ministers to it." This next bit I'll quote, but it doesn't really parse, and these are notes again, so I'm trying to make out his handwriting. But he says, "The odious character of this generalization," and mind you that in saying that it's odious to an unsophisticated mind, I'm not saying that it's certainly false, for states of things we detest may nonetheless be true. He goes on to say what hides it is sometimes appeals to caution and prudence, real virtues are enlisted. We know indeed that Darwin did read Malthus, and the skeptical Professor Peirce helps us see that at least it's contestable, that odious generalization. So what more might be said? I think one of Peirce's contributions is how to analyze dynamic systems, how to analyze systems that are themselves changing. His insights into that sort of systemic progression still, I think, can help us in talking about God, evolution, and agape. That is, we still need to distinguish, as Peirce puts it, between what he called tychastic evolution, fortuitous variation, anancastic evolution, mechanical necessity, and what he calls agapastic evolution, creative love. He had a fondness for sort of overly difficult neologisms, but here's the point. The key to strong agapism, as I would prefer to call it, is developmental teleology. Peirce's phrase, developmental teleology. That is, genuine spontaneity unfolding towards an intelligible end, what Karl Hausmann has termed, quote, a growth of purposes, not a growth of ideas in accordance with purposes. That is, this last notion involves spontaneity and self-giving, and what distinguishes agape from eros, neighbor love from justice, game theoretic advantage, from the evolution of an entire system. Stated differently, it does seem to me that early game theorists often wanted a social system to evolve to maximal utility via self-interested purposes already in place among the participants. Let's put together participants that are competing for limited resource, and see how cooperation might evolve. And it does indeed seem that such competitors will evolve a form of cooperation. But again, point number one, often the defector who's undetected will get a free ride and or be simply sort of relegated to oblivion. Or at best, you get a cooperation that is enlightened self-interest. But is it possible to conceive of a system evolving new purposes, evolving beyond cooperation based on mutual competition? Again, early game theorists often wanted a social system to evolve to maximal utility via self-interested purposes in place among the participants. In reality, that only happens when someone's willing to let go of self-interest and act for the emergent common good out of a robust benevolence. Put it this way, goodness only arises in some systems when a player consciously embraces a new and wider purpose than previously held or implied by the initial objectives of the game. Peirce's insights illustrate once again, I think, the limits of a purely consequentialist analysis of altruism, cooperation, and agape. An analysis of this sort blinds us to motives which a player may intentionally set about to transform in a game. What about the motives of a player who's trying to transform, indeed, the other players? A strong agapist, for instance, might accept losses in the prisoner's dilemma and ultimatum game, not because he's looking for return or enhanced reputation among the other players, indirect reciprocity, but in order to convert the defectors for their own sake. Is this sort of rationale possible within game theoretic models? A strong agapist may punish even, but this will be chiefly motivated by the need of the malefactor for retribution and reformation. The true altruist, in any case, would self-sacrificially call the selfish out of the manipulative system that's presupposed to begin with. That may well seem either irrational or diabolical, given the game's initial considerations. Certainly, to a pure consequentialist, it will seem to be ineffective. But again, the crucial question is whether teleology of this sort is cause or effect. Does self-sacrifice arise as a result of self-interested competition? Let me ask that again. Does self-sacrifice arise as a result of self-interested competition, in which case it represents a novel or even deceptive strategy to win? Or does self-sacrifice emerge in spite of competition, in which case it represents perhaps a purposeful redefinition of winning itself? Now, interestingly, referring to the Gospel of John, Peirce, for his part, opted for a still more radical third possibility. Self-sacrifice does not appear in spite of competition. Rather, self-sacrifice is prior to and responsible for competition for Peirce. Peirce, that is, construed agape as the cause of evolution rather than its effect. Agape transcends winning and losing altogether. Agape creates competition, but it also limits and transforms it. Indeed, Peirce conceived of agape as not just creative human love, but as the canonic love of God, generative of all reality. Right? Here's a whopping metaphysical claim, right? That the whole of the reality of the universe is inspired by an agapic love. Such love made the world, and such love made evolution. Such love made evolution, again, is this ongoing, evolving process in time and space. Such love made the world rather than being made by it, and it permits creatures in the world to be real and free and to be of no necessary benefit to the Creator. That's real altruism in my book. That's sort of robust metaphysical altruism. Now, suffice it to say, in any case, that Peirce formulated a non-naturalistic view that allowed for both evolution and the evolution of evolution. Allowed for both evolution and the evolution of evolution, biologically and culturally. He thereby, in my judgment, takes us both beyond Darwin and beyond Socrates by taking us back to a theistic account of love. Now, what would move one to embrace such theism? This is a big question, and I don't have a lot of time, but it's worth touching on. what would move one to talk about the whole system being designed by a first cause and possibly having a final end? I myself find the argument from the apparent orderliness of nature to God as its designer, Paley's famous inference from the world as watch-like to a divine watchmaker, I myself find that too thin a reed on which to base religious conviction. That is, the physical universe presents too mixed a picture to ground a stable natural theology, in my judgment. Nature is replete with geologic and atmospheric wonders, together with intricate ecologies of splendid flora and fauna, but it's also dominated by the predator-prey relation, marred by astounding amounts of human and animal suffering and death. Tennyson's red in tooth and claw goes not just for animal nature, but also for our own, at least at times. So much beauty and so much complexity in the world, but also so much ugliness and profligacy. Can one read intelligent design off of this Janus bifrons? Can one read intelligent design off of the natural order? Michael Behe, William Dembski, and Jonathan Wells have lately argued yes, while Kenneth Miller, Robert Pennock, and Eugenie Scott have argued no. More compelling than the argument from design, however, is what Wells and others have called the argument to design. What's that mean? I think although many Christian theologians have indeed appealed to a cosmological argument from design, it was one of St. Thomas's 5 ways, more salient in the tradition, I would argue, is the move from an encounter with the living God to trust that the cosmos created by God is coherent and ultimately good. That is, when you don't detect purposeful design in nature, but rather postulate its presence given the reality antecedently of God. With me, the order of inference, that is from the supernatural to the natural rather than the other way around. The argument to design still leaves one the traditional theodicy problem, the problem of evil. Right? Why would an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent deity create a world so vulnerable to pain, sin, and mortality? For his part, Peirce interestingly judged, quote, again, this is from the Houghton manuscripts, quote, the only solution of the problem of evil is to recognize that the supreme love embraces hate as a variety of itself. That sin is a creation of God and as such is good in certain stages of development. Peirce, that is, has what I would call a Felix culpa view, that all this pain and suffering, even the predator-prey relation, is part of God's good plan. He even goes so far as to say God delights in evil. Now, I'm holding up Peirce, of course, as a champion of a kind of non-naturalistic account, but this pill I find rather hard to swallow myself. I don't know about you. But this sort of view does seem to me actually to make hash out of God's goodness. I can understand God's tolerating hatred and suffering for a higher purpose. That is, I can understand tolerance of that sort, rather like a parent encouraging a toddler to walk on her own, even while knowing that the child will fall down, skin her knee, in fact, throw a temper tantrum in the process. One can perhaps understand, again, tolerating that sort of pain for a higher purpose, but I can't fathom a God actually enjoying or willing evil for its own sake. Such a deity would be at best a schizophrenic bungler, at worst a sadistic monster, in neither case worthy of worship, I would say. What do we make of the theodicy problem? Peirce's solution actually, again, seems to me no solution at all. Why? Because it actually denies one of the terms of the question. God is not, in fact, all good. But that said, I myself have no answer to the theodicy problem. You'll perhaps not be surprised to hear. But I do think that to see it in light of the argument to rather than from design allows you first to trust in God instead of the world. That's why it's an article of faith, to think that the world is ultimately good and orderly. It allows us, if you will, to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith, as Kant says famously in the First Critique. In any case, if neo-Darwinism is construed as the argument against design, rather than merely an argument without design, then it's at odds with Christianity. Again, in a way, the prime thing I'm trying to do today is pick a fight. I'm trying to show that there really is conflict here. And again, it seems to me if neo-Darwinism is construed as the argument against design, then there really is a fight. It's at odds with Christianity, so much the worse for Christianity, perhaps. But I agree with Wells that if neo-Darwinism refutes the argument to design, then Christianity is false. Darwin, interestingly, at one point acknowledged to Charles Hodge that this was the case. Hodge, Princeton Seminary's famous systematic theologian, kept pressing Darwin in his own day on this and finally got him to concede this. But here's the point. I know of no strictly scientific way to settle this dispute. There's no strictly naturalistic way to explain where nature and her laws came from. Trying to explain the origin of life in terms of descent with modification alone is like trying to explain the origin of the universe in terms of particles and forces that didn't exist until after the Big Bang. Let me make one more final point and then I'll wrap up. I think in a way now we come to one of the most important points of all, a point that's been lurking in the background all along. If the regnant neo-Darwinian story is all there is to life, then how can we escape bad old-fashioned social Darwinism as the truth of our condition? Let me ask that again. If the regnant neo-Darwinian story is all there is to life, then how can we escape bad old-fashioned social Darwinism as the truth of our condition? How can we keep success in genetic terms from dictating success in cultural terms? Now, the Stoic in me suspects that no picture of human nature can be declared a priori to be too bad to be true, but the ethicist in me is confident that if the neo-Darwinian picture is accurate, then it's true to be bad, or good, morally speaking. That is, the problem with much neo-Darwinism is that explaining human behavior in terms of reproductive fitness, again, either genetically or culturally, explains away the virtues to be attended to, explains away virtuous behavior. Even reciprocal justice, let alone altruism, at times sounds like a game one plays only so long as defection might be discovered and punished. One feigns fairness or even empathy in order to get others to cooperate. And to feign these really well, one must make others and finally oneself believe that there's real mutuality present. In fact, however, there's neither this nor could there be such a commitment. Millions of years of Malthusian scarcity and Darwinian selection have made the human animal irredeemably exploitative and amoral, so there's only temporary expediency, bolstered perhaps by a thoroughgoing delusion. So we get the soliloquy of the selfish gene, if you will. Quote, I'll get my person to help others if they will help him, and I'll move him to cultivate a personal reputation for reliability to help ensure such a return from others, but I'll also move my person to cheat with impunity if I can, though I won't permit him to know this consciously, lest he give me away. Now, lest I seem to be sort of importing this view unfairly, if I can find it, let me offer a quote from Darwin himself. Darwin writes, "It may be difficult, but we ought to admire the savage instinctive hatred of the queen bee, which urges her instantly to destroy the young queens, her daughters, as soon as born, or to perish herself in the combat. For undoubtedly this is for the good of the community, and maternal love or maternal hatred, though the latter fortunately is most rare, is all the same to the inexorable principle of natural selection." Obvious question, what is the force of the ought in that quotation? It sure sounds like reproductive utilitarianism, however savage, is to be judged morally good, if not inevitable. Now, human beings are not bees, of course, but natural selection is thought to bear on all living species. How do we escape an obligation to admire human hatred, human destructiveness, when they contribute to the good of the community? Nietzsche eschews such an escape, recommending instead a frank will to power that contributes to the evolution of the Übermensch, but other naturalists aren't so forthright. I'll simply end again with the question, is understanding agape compatible with practicing it? Certainly, in the Christian tradition, Christ-like love is thought fundamentally to be transformative of reciprocity, transformative of mutual advantage. For better or for worse, it's thought to transcend any economy of exchange. Indeed, the suffering servant is primarily thought to transcend such parochialisms of family, race, class, gender. Is this merely a kind of quaint delusion, or is it indictment of much evolutionary theory, final conclusions? It does feel like a fight. A supernaturalistic teleological account of evolution based on the priority of agapic love is compatible, I think, with evolution as descent with variation. But again, a fully naturalistic anti-teleological account is not compatible with Christian faith and morals, and as far as I can see, not compatible with any morality requiring a personal justice and a universal love. To be playful, it is indeed a sin to kill a mockingbird, but also to kill a finch. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Jackson. I know some people have to leave, but we would like to have a few minutes of questions, simply because he's thrown down such a demanding gauntlet that I feel that at least Martin Novak and some of his confreres might like to respond or question him. But the floor is open, and Tim, I suggest you field questions,
Sure.
And we can go till about 20 past.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I do realize this was an awful lot, and I did try to put it as spunkily as I could. I hope I didn't offend any evolutionary biologists in the room. But, yes.
I just want to ask if in actual practice in life, what you're saying about love, people looking at that pain is not sacrifice. Also, outside of Christianity, obtaining the aesthetic, define it so narrowly, so that it doesn't form an articulation with the ethical, because the distinction between self-sacrifice and charity begins at home. So in fact, depending how you look at that one and the children, that could be half commitment. They look well, they were fed. So looking from the outside, you don't know the aesthetic value. The question of woman, aesthetic value, the nourishment she's getting from that, and she feels gratified in what she's doing, assuming that a human being is limited and will die and then only have get the resource. So there is an aesthetic value that. So you're talking of culture generally, but culture is always changing and redefining that opposite of sacrifice and what would be good for the individual. I'm not even thinking of the community, hence selfishness. So who says outside the life that is allowing or sacrificing that they're not getting reward aesthetically, ethically, and therefore it's not really a sacrifice in a bad sense.
Right.
And I'm not working with the ethical of good and evil. I'm outside of Christianity.
Right. No, I'm with you, and it is always interesting to me. Some do find the Rene sort of deeply offensive and even misogynistic. I think a lot does turn on, though, whether it's voluntary or not. That is, if you're freely entering into this sort of self-giving, I could see it perhaps being fulfilling. I think it will come at a cost nonetheless. But if it's coerced, then it does seem to me in the nature of the case, it can't be seen as morally fulfilling. But if it is consensual and constructive, I could see it being open. I'm not a woman. I don't know what it's like to nurse, but I presume that there's some gratification involved there. But see, I think often when one talks about agape, and in particular defines it as open to self-sacrifice, that's heard as simply vilifying self-love or vilifying self-interest. And I certainly don't want to do that, or even vilifying eros. Some Christian theologians have done that, but I don't want to make that move. Self-interest, self-love, erotic attraction have their place, but it does seem to me the Christian message is one where those are secondary and come as a result of love of God and love of neighbor, that they're, again, the sort of flower rather than the root of virtue. But sometimes giving does actually prove to be in service of your own prudential interest. Other thoughts? Yes, Jorge.
Thanks for the presentation. It's very rich. I had a question about your arguments to the first conclusion, and I'm wondering if a response. My question is about the arguments for the first of your listed conclusions there, and I'm wondering if a response can't be made to that argument, relying on a more consistent and rigorous distinction between function of say, objective function or evolutionary biological function on the one hand, and personal subjective intention or motivation on the other. So it might be that ultimately an individual acts in his or her subjective motivation and intention simply to help others and at great sacrifice to the self. Nevertheless, it could be that the function of that sort of behavior, and even perhaps having people who act for that sort of purpose, is somehow or another to increase the probability of the replication of their own genes or some such. Or moreover, that this could simply arise from time to time as a random mutation or a selective variation, which itself has some sort of ultimate purpose. So I don't see that the biological, the evolutionary argument really requires a kind of utilitarianism, a kind of instrumentalism, which seems to be your argument suggests.
Yeah, there was a section in the paper that I had to leave out where I try to wrestle with the deep metaphysical questions of human freedom, whether it is possible to construe rational agents with freedom acting intentionally in the name of the other or God, is intelligible in a naturalistic universe. And as you know better than I, it's an old question. But at least some of the neo-Darwinians that I've read, Dawkins, Ridley, really do seem to see the person and the person's motives as epiphenomenal to the genes, such that what's really going on, if you will, is this sort of naturalistic process and the consequences thereof. But I would grant, in short, that if you really can uncouple the two and talk about human agents that so transcend the selfish gene, that they're freely and morally being motivated by desire to love God, love the neighbor, then there isn't the sort of conflict on that level that I've talked about. Even there, if the whole process is undesigned, it does seem to me incompatible with Christianity. But again, perhaps so much the worse for Christianity. But I'm just not convinced that at least a good number of neo-Darwinians actually would grant that sort of scenario. That is, you just get double talk, it seems to me. You get someone like Dawkins talking about the person as simply a replication machine, right? Something cast up, including your emotions, cast up for the sake of genetic replication, such that, again, your motives are delusional when you think you're loving. That, in fact, there is simply a reduction here. That, as I've said to Sarah and Martin a number of times, it turns on this. Is the neo-Darwinian account of altruism an account that might be construed as explanation as translation, or is it explanation as elimination? And here I think of the following. If I explain that table is a cloud of molecules, if I give a sort of subatomic description of that physical object, I haven't thereby rendered problematic the ontology of tables and chairs. I've just given you an alternate vocabulary, and depending on context, you'll use one idiom or another. But if I say, in contrast, a witch is nothing but an erotic woman, or a warlock is nothing but an erotic man, I'm giving you a causal explanation of the behavior in terms that does problematize the original ontology of witches and warlocks. And I'm saying often, at least, the neo-Darwinian account seems to me explanation as elimination, right? Where agape really, if understood, is seen not to be motivated by this sort of charity, but in fact reducible to its utilitarian consequence. That's not always owned up to, but it just seems to me, again, often you get simply double talk. Ruse is an interesting example of somebody who just sort of comes clean, it seems to me, and says, if this is right, then ethics is simply a group delusion foisted on us by the genes. And at least what I'm wanting to press is, tell me why that isn't right? Tell me why that isn't actually the implication of this analysis. But I want to grant that many would not go that way. But I want to hear a lot more about how to avoid that move, how to avoid, so to speak, the naturalistic fallacies, what I call the naturalistic evasion. Yes?
I think I'm hearing you say that Darwinism lacks any teleological element and therefore is inconsistent with Christianity.
Again, he would grant at times that the laws of nature and nature itself is designed. It's just the specific outcome. So the human species was not designed by God. It was not planned. it's simply a chance upshot of random mutation, natural selection.
I think Martin wants to.
Okay.
No, you don't.
I forget to play that.
That's the debate between Gray and Darwin, right? They both agreed, at times at least, that nature is designed. It's just Gray thought that even the specific outcome was designed, and Darwin says no.
Let's just take one more in open session, and then we can certainly talk further, more privately. Yes.
You've said so much that's interesting. I just want to focus on one thought from a Christian point of view. It seems to me the big fight is between the primacy of supernatural versus natural. And so the Christian will be altruistic and agapic in order to achieve Christ's commandment, which ultimately would translate into a sort of a supernatural selfishness, which is that one achieves eternal life, which would be the greatest reward anyone could have. Most neo-Darwinists don't believe that that's real, but they might at least understand it in their own terms, if you see what I'm saying.
Sure. It's a great question, and I do indeed think that that's the perennial temptation for agape in Christian context, to make it a ticket for heavenly reward. And Christ himself, at least according to Scripture, talks about storing up treasures in heaven. But that said, that's exactly why I think one ought to not make the move of making heavenly reward a sort of motivation. I think you might see it as a consequence, even a devout hope. But I more favor Jesus' injunction to not let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. And you practice agape for its own sake. But I hear you. And here I think Nietzsche is right. We're inclined to sort of substitute the faith of Christ in Christ's radical sense that practicing love of God and neighbor is its own reward. We're inclined to substitute that with faith in Christ as a ticket to heaven. And that isn't agape either. So you can err on both sides, so to speak.
Tim, I want to thank you very, very much for this very thought-provoking lecture. As people will be aware, depending on your meta-ethical theory, the fight will be differently construed. We've already had in this series a Kantian 2 weeks ago. We will have next year a Thomist. So we'll see how these different perspectives on ethical theory result in different perceptions of how neo-Darwinism can or cannot connect with a robustly theological view.
Can I say
No, it won't be finished.
one more word about the design issue, though, and I think this gentleman may have been leading in this direction. I find it fascinating that sometimes an account of charity, an account of virtue quite generally, an account of evolution, indeed, will be judged to be simply prescinding from design questions altogether. Right? You'll get the argument that this is the problem with intelligent design advocates, that they're applying a non-scientific principle, design, to scientific inquiry, when in fact evolution and evolutionary accounts are simply prescinding from that altogether. But simultaneously, it seems to me, you also get moves where the argument is, no, Darwin has shown, looking at the taxonomy of species, fossil record, whatever, that in fact there is no design in nature. But you can't have it both ways, right? You can't say that design is an unscientific principle, and thus when, say, intelligent design or Christian folk talk about the design of evolution, they're being unscientific. You can't say that and say that somehow Darwinism has disproven design, right? If Darwinism can disprove it, then it is a scientific issue that can be discussed in those terms. And it's having it both ways that I think is often the problem. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.